In our last problem, we have 3 inequalities and equations involving a square root that we wish to solve all at the same time. We have the square root of 2x plus 13 equals 3, is greater than 3, and is less than 3. Now, this would be your original problem, but we would never leave it like this. Whenever we have inequalities, meaning anything with a greater than or a less than, we'd rather have 0 on the other side than just a regular number. So what we'll do instead is we'll put a 0 on the other side by moving the 3. How do you move the 3? Well, you subtract a 3 from both sides of the equation or inequality. So we'll subtract a 3 from both sides. What that does is that will move the 3 to the other side and leave us with a 0 on the right-hand side. So that's what we did over here to get the 0 on the other side. We subtracted the 3 from both sides. Notice what that does is it leaves the 3 on the outside of the square root when you move the 3 over, when you subtract it from both sides. So what we're going to, instead of solving the original, we'd like to solve the 3 that actually have 0 on the other side. Why? Because in terms of a graph, what is 0? Well, 0 is the x-axis. So if here's my x-axis, if I'm looking at equal to 0, that means where you cross the x-axis. Greater than 0 means when you're above the x-axis, and less than 0 means when you are below the x-axis. We already know what a square root graph kind of looks like. It looks something like this, a half of a parabola kind of on its side. So the first thing that we'd be looking for is, like we said, when do you equal 0, which is when you cross the x-axis. The next thing that we'd be looking for is when are you greater than 0, meaning when are you above the x-axis? That would be this part of your graph. And the last part you'd be looking for is when are you below the x-axis? When are you negative? When are you less than 0? That would be this little part to your graph. So how are we going to figure out our values? Well, we need, in order to answer our questions, we need to figure out some values. First of all, we need to figure out where we cross the x-axis, meaning when are we equal to 0. So let's just start out with finding out when am I equal to 0. So, moving right along, when is the square root of 2x plus 13 minus 3 equal to 0? Well, in order to solve this, we're going to go backwards a little bit. We need to get the square root by itself by adding 3 to both sides of the equation. That will give me that the square root of 2x plus 13 equals 3. Now that the square root's by itself, we can get rid of the square root by squaring both sides of the equation. On the left-hand side, squaring the square root will make those cancel out, and will leave you with just what was underneath, the 2x plus 13. On the right-hand side, however, I had 3 squared, which was 9. So I have a regular equation now that I can solve normally. I can subtract 13 from both sides to get the x by itself, which will give me 2x equals -4. Keep going. Divide both sides by 2, and that will give me that x equals -2. This is where I'm going to cross the x-axis for my graph. So continuing right along, now I have at least part of my picture filled in. Here's my x-axis, and I know that my half of a parabola, my square root graph, will cross the x-axis we found out at here at -2. So that's half of my problem of answering all three questions at once. The other part of my problem is I need to figure out where my graph starts here at this point. Well, that's actually something we've already done before. That's finding its domain. How do I find a square root's domain? Well, we were looking at, again, our problem was the square root of 2x plus 13, and then a minus 3 on the outside. To find the domain of a square root function, you're only actually concerned about what's inside the square root. Well, so I need to worry about what's inside the square root, and that needs to be greater than or equal to 0. So what's inside of our square root? Well, that's the 2x plus 13. And again, that needs to be greater than or equal to 0, meaning not negative. It's the same thing that we did earlier. Well, how do we solve this? Well, we're going to solve it like we did a normal inequality by subtracting 13 from both sides, which will give us that 2x is greater than or equal to -13. Keep on going. We're going to divide both sides by 2 to get that x is greater than or equal to -13/2. So that's our domain. Remember, what does that graph mean? It means you're starting out because of the equal to here with a bracket at -13/2, and it means that the function will continue on to infinity. What that means for our picture is that means our picture actually starts at -13/2. It gives me the exact value of where this point starts. It starts at -13/2. So our domain was this guy, the -13/2 to infinity. Be careful, that's not our answer. It helps us find our answer, but it's not our answer. Remember, our answer for A should be, when do I equal 0? Well, remember that my graph equals 0 when I cross the x-axis, which happens at -2. So my answer for A is just -2. That's why it's in braces. Only -2 is where I'm crossing the x-axis, when I'm equal to 0. Part B asked, when am I greater than 0, meaning when am I above the x-axis? Well, you're above the x-axis in this part of your graph when you're greater than 0. That's what you're looking for when you're asking for when am I greater than 0. I'm looking for when am I above the x-axis. Greater than 0 means above x-axis. Positive values. Well, notice that this part of your graph begins at -2 and continues off to infinity. The question is, should I have a parentheses or a bracket at -2? Well, notice it said that we were greater than, not greater than or equal to, so we're going to just use a regular parentheses. The last part, C, is going to be the hardest, which is when I am less than 0. When am I below the x-axis? When am I negative? That's this little piece. Well, that little piece ends at -2 and starts at -13/2, where that point was for the domain. Now, you do have to be careful. When they do say, when are you less than 0, it means that we should use parentheses at the -2, because that's where I'm equal to 0. I want to be actually less than 0. Be careful. This point that's down here should be included because it is below 0. It is negative. Good way of remembering this too is also, if you look at the domain, has a greater than or equal to at the negative 13 halves, which is again a reminder that you should be including it. So you should have a bracket at the negative 13 halves, despite the fact that you have just a less than symbol here. So notice we have the answer to A, B, and C, and we were able to do it without the aid of a calculator, but we had to draw a picture, and we had to find where we cross the x-axis, meaning when do I equal 0, and we also had to find the square root's domain, which happens whenever the inside is greater than or equal to 0.